Chapter 34, The Development of the Colonial Empire of Britain, 1739–1760, by Charles Oman. When the unwilling Walpole was driven into war with Spain in 1739 by the clamours of the nation, he believed that he was about to become responsible for a very dangerous struggle, for he had private knowledge of the existence of the family compact, and knew that France was ready to back up Spain. England, on the other hand, was entirely without allies, having gone to war in defence of her maritime commerce, a subject in which no other power felt any interest. As a matter of fact, however, the war was necessary and wise, for we were bound to come into collision with France and Spain sooner or later on the matter of trade. They could not endure to look upon the rapid expansion of England's commercial and colonial power, which had been increasing at a prodigious rate since the Peace of Utrecht. Our merchants were beginning to seize an ever-growing share of the trade of the world, and to oust the French, Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese from all the more distant markets, especially those of Africa, India and the remoter East. In India, the East India Company was making advances which exasperated its French rivals. In South America, the Spaniards felt that their ancient monopoly was gradually slipping from their hands. In North America, the prodigious growth in strength and population of our seaboard colonies threatened a speedy end to the French settlement in Canada. Since the acquisition of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland by the Treaty of Utrecht, the English dominions seemed to shut out from the sea the vast but sparsely peopled tracts along the St. Lawrence which still belonged to King Louis. In the West Indies, Jamaica and Barbados were gradually drawing away the wealth pg 499 of the Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, the old centres of the sugar and tobacco trade. The French and Spaniards, therefore, had good reason to fear and hate England, and if we wished to keep our control of the commerce of the world, we were bound to fight for it. It was a misfortune, however, that we were committed to the struggle while Walpole was still minister. Disliking the war, he would not throw himself heartily into it, grudged spending money, and refused to undertake any serious operations. A few expeditions to Spanish America were all that he sent out. The first under Admiral Vernon, though composed of no more than 6 ships of war, took Portobello, one of the chief harbours of the Spanish Main, 1739, but a second and much larger armament under the same leader failed disastrously before Cartagena, partly owing to mismanagement, partly to the marsh fever, which struck down the English in their trenches, 1741. Walpole bore the discredit of his sluggish action and his failures. He was bitterly attacked in Parliament by all the Whigs whom he had been excluding from office for the last 20 years, and gradually saw the reins of power slipping from his hands. In time of war, all his bribery and jobbing could not avail to save him. His bought majority dwindled away, and early in 1742 he was defeated in the House of Commons and forced to resign. He retired into private life and died 3 years later, making no further show in politics. He was succeeded by a coalition of all the Whig factions, under the nominal premiership of Lord Wilmington, the greatest nonentity in the whole cabinet. The real chiefs of the new ministry were Lord Carteret, an able diplomatist with a vast knowledge of European politics, and the 2 Pelhams, Thomas, Duke of Newcastle, and Henry, his younger brother. These 2 kinsmen were a pair of busy and ambitious mediocrities, who stuck like limpets to office. They had been reared in Walpole's school, understood all his arts of management and corruption, and had served under him to the last, though for a year or more they had been quietly intriguing for his fall, in order that they might succeed to his power. The Carteret-Pelham ministry had to face a much larger PG 500 problem in European politics than the mere struggle with Spain. During the last year, the whole continent had been set ablaze by the War of the Austrian Succession. In 1740 died the Emperor Charles Roman VI, the Archduke Charles who had been a claimant for the Spanish throne in the days before the Peace of Utrecht. He was the last male of the House of Habsburg, and his death opened a question somewhat resembling that of the Spanish succession in 1702. Charles had determined that his broad dominions, the Austrian archduchies, the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia, the Austrian Netherlands, and the duchies of Milan and Parma in Italy, should pass in a body to his daughter Maria Theresa. He chose to ignore the fact that his own elder brother, Joseph I, had left 2 daughters, who on any principle of hereditary succession had a better claim to the Habsburg inheritance than their younger cousin. The elder Princess Maria Amelia was the wife of Charles, the reigning elector of Bavaria. Charles Roman VI spent the last 20 years of his life in arranging for his daughter's quiet succession. He drew up an instrument called the Pragmatic Sanction, by which she was recognized as his heiress, and got it ratified by the estates of the various principalities of his realm. He also induced most of the powers of Europe at one time and another to guarantee this settlement. England, France, Spain, Prussia, and Russia had all been brought to assent to it by concessions of some sort. Only the Elector of Bavaria, the prince whose rights were infringed by the pragmatic sanction, had consistently refused to accept any compensation for abandoning his wife's claims. But when Charles died in 1740, it was seen how little the promises of most of the European powers were worth. The accession to the Habsburg heritage of a young princess with a doubtful title was too great an opportunity to be lost by the greedy neighbours of Austria. When Charles of Bavaria laid claim to his uncle's dominions and presented himself as a candidate for the imperial throne, he got prompt assistance from many quarters. The first to stir was Frederick II, the able and unscrupulous king of Prussia. Frederick had some ancient claims to certain parts of the Duchy of Silesia. He had also a devouring ambition and the best disciplined army PG 501 in Europe, an army which his eccentric father Frederick William had spent a whole lifetime in organizing. Without any formal declaration of war, Frederick II threw himself on Silesia and swept out of it the armies which Maria Theresa hastily sent against him, 1741. Then France and Spain threw in their lot with the Elector of Bavaria. Louis XV had his eye on the conquest of the Austrian Netherlands, while the old Philip V wanted the duchies of Parma and Milan for his younger son. Thus beset by France, Spain, Prussia and Bavaria, it seemed certain that Maria Theresa must succumb. Her rival Charles was chosen emperor by a majority of the electors, and it seemed as if the imperial scepter was about to pass from the House of Habsburg. The Austrian Netherlands, Silesia, Bohemia, and the Milanese were all invaded at once, and the armies of Maria Theresa could not make head at so many points against the numerical superiority of their foes. The only ally to whom she could look for aid was England, who was already the open enemy of Spain, and who could not tolerate the conquest of the Netherlands by France. An appeal for aid to this quarter met with a ready response. George II was anxious to help the Queen of Hungary because he disliked his nephew Frederick II, and did not wish to see a Bavarian emperor. Carteret, the leading spirit in the ministry, was even more eager for the fight. He was a far-sighted man who had realized the fact that England must inevitably come into collision with France from their rivalry in trade and colonization, and he therefore held that France's enemies were our friends. It was his wish to see England embark boldly in the strife, and send a large army to Germany to aid the Austrians. If France were involved in an exhausting continental war, he held that she would be unable at the same time to keep up a maritime struggle with England. Accordingly, the ministry promised the Austrians a large subsidy, took 16,000 Hanoverian troops into British pay, and sent all the available strength of the national army to Germany. George II, who was burning for the fray, placed himself at the head of the Anglo-Hanoverian forces and moved rapidly down to the Main, to attack the flank of the French army which was invading Austria. The fortunes of Maria Theresa now began to look more prosperous. Carteret got her to buy off the ablest of her assailants, the King of Prussia, by ceding him Silesia. When Frederick had withdrawn from the struggle, the French and Bavarians were driven back from Austria and retreated up the Danube. It was against their flank that George was operating in 1743, when his rather rash advance into the midst of foes very superior in numbers brought on the Battle of Dettingen, July 27, 1743. Finding that he was beset by forces nearly double the strength of his own 30,000 men, the king faced about to retire up the banks of the Main, but the van of the French army of the Duc de Noailles outmarched him, and threw itself across his path at the village of Dettingen, while the main body of the enemy was rapidly coming up on his flank. George hastily formed up his troops as they arrived, and dashed forward to cut his way through, leading the advance in person. He was entirely successful, drove the French into the Main with great loss, and completely extricated himself from his difficulties. This was the last occasion on which a king of England has ever been under fire. Further successes followed the victory of Dettingen. The Austrians overran Bavaria, and the Emperor Charles was obliged to lay down his arms and ask for peace. Carteret, who had followed the king to Germany, called together a congress at Worms, at which the representatives of England, Holland, Sardinia and Saxony guaranteed the pragmatic sanction and the integrity of the dominions of the House of Habsburg. Next spring, the Allies pledged themselves to invade France, and Carteret, in his moment of triumph, drank to the restoration of Alsace to Germany, a wish not to be fulfilled for another 127 years. But England and Austria were still far from their goal. The attack on France had to be postponed, because the unscrupulous Frederick of Prussia renewed the war in the north and fell upon the rear of the Austrians. They withdrew great bodies of troops to face him and were left comparatively weak on their western front. Not long afterwards, Carteret, the soul of the Continental War, lost his place at the head of the ministry. His jealous colleagues, PG 503, the two Pelhams, were anxious to get rid of him and took a mean advantage of his long absences in Germany. They allowed him to be attacked as favouring a Hanoverian, not an English policy, and as consulting the wishes of the king rather than those of the Parliament. Carteret was violently assailed by a young politician named William Pitt, whose cry was always that France should be assailed at sea and in her colonies, not on her continental frontiers. The Pelhams would not defend him, and suffered him to be loaded with many ungrounded accusations. The opposition called his ministry the drunken administration, because he was somewhat flighty in his demeanour, and was known to love his bottle of Port Overwell. They accused him of lavishing on German allies money that should have gone to our own fleet, and raised such a storm of words against him that the Pelhams had their excuse for throwing him over, a feat which they accomplished in the end of 1744, to the great detriment of England. William Pitt, when a minister himself in later years, confessed that he had discovered in the course of time that Carteret's plans were excellent, and that he had himself put them into practice with success, after having so often denounced them as ruinous and reckless. The Pelhams thus became supreme in the conduct of affairs, and stuck to office as closely as their master Walpole. Henry, the younger of the two, a fretful, suspicious, industrious mediocrity, was prime minister till he died in 1754. His elder brother, the Duke, then succeeded him, and kept his feeble hand on the helm of state till he lost office in 1756. English policy under these two narrow and shifty boroughmongers soon lost the vigour that the guidance of Carteret had imparted to it. The war with France continued, but no longer with the same success as before. In the spring of 1745, the armies of Louis XV, under the able Maurice of Saxony, the Maréchal de Saxe as the French called him, fell upon the Austrian Netherlands. Maria Theresa had so few troops in this quarter that the defence of the Belgian provinces fell entirely upon the English and Dutch. The Allied armies did not act together with much success, and the Dutch general, the Count of Waldeck, quarrelled with his colleague George Duke of Cumberland, the younger son of George II. It was this PG 504 want of cooperation which led to the loss of the bloody Battle of Fontenoy, May 11, 1745. The French army was besieging Tournai, when Waldeck and Cumberland came up to relieve it, and found the enemy drawn up along a line of woods, strengthened with redoubts on their flanks, a position much like the neighbouring field of Malplaquet, where Marlborough had won his last fight 36 years before. While Waldeck skirmished feebly with the French wings, the stubborn and reckless young Duke pushed into the centre of the hostile army with a solid column of English and Hanoverian infantry. He broke through two lines of the French and cut their host in twain, but failed for want of support on the flanks. He was encompassed by the French reserves and forced back with fearful loss to his old position, but the enemy were too maltreated to molest him further. The campaign of 1745 was still undecided, when the greater part of the English army was suddenly called home to face a new and unexpected danger. The ministers of Louis XV had determined to try the effect of stirring up a Jacobite rebellion, hoping to distract the strength of England, even if the House of Hanover could not be overthrown. James Stuart, the old pretender, was now elderly and had always been apathetic, but his son Charles Edward Stuart was a young prince of a very different character. Reckless, adventurous, and light-hearted, he was the very man to lead a desperate venture. The French gathered an army of 15,000 men at Dunkirk, and promised to put it at his disposal if he would invade Scotland. But a storm scattered the transports, and the troops were ultimately drawn off to the war in Flanders. Nevertheless, Charles Edward resolved to persevere, and on hearing of the fight of Fontenoy, slipped off on a small privateer and landed in Inverness with no more than 7 companions, the 7 men of Moidart, as the Jacobites called them. His arrival was quite unexpected, and he had nothing more to rely upon than the traditional attachment of the Highlanders to the House of Stuart. The chiefs of the West were dismayed at the recklessness of the venture, and it was with difficulty that the enthusiasm and personal charm of the young prince induced them to take arms. At first only a few hundreds of the Camerons and MacDonald's PG 505 joined him, But the absolute imbecility displayed by the English government encouraged him more and more to make the venture. The Marquis of Tullibardine, an exile since 1715, roused the Perthshire clans, and the insurrection spread to south and east. The Pelham cabinet only got news of the prince's coming 3 weeks after his landing in Moidart. They were in no small degree alarmed, for well nigh the whole army was oversea in Flanders, and no one knew how far disaffection might have extended in England and the Scottish lowlands. The only troops in the north were 4 battalions of foot and 2 newly raised regiments of dragoons. This small army of 3,000 men was entrusted to Sir John Cope, one of the incompetent men whom the Pelhams loved to employ, because they were pliant and docile. Cope hurried north, hoping to relieve the 2 isolated military posts of Fort William and Fort Augustus, the sole garrisons of the West Highlands, but finding the insurgents in possession of the pass of Coryarac, over which his road ran, he swerved eastward to execute a long circular march by way of Inverness. Thus he was no longer placed between the enemy and the lowlands, and left the way to Edinburgh open. The prince's generalship was always bold even to recklessness. The moment that Cope had passed north of him, he dashed down into Perthshire and struck at the capital of Scotland. He met with no resistance till he was quite close to Edinburgh, when 600 dragoons, the only force left in the lowlands, fled before him at the skirmish of Coltbrigg. The Scots of the south, Whigs and Presbyterians though they were, showed an extraordinary apathy. They did not join the prince, but they refused to take arms for King George. The militia of Edinburgh, whom the half-hearted magistrates had called to arms, dispersed when the Highlanders appeared at their gates. Thus Prince Charles was able to seize the city, to proclaim his father king at the Market Cross, and to hold his court at Holyrood. Soon, however, he had to fight to preserve his conquest. Cope, on hearing that the Highland army had passed southward, had hurried to the coast and taken ship with his men, hoping to reach Edinburgh before the prince. But on landing at Dunbar, he found that he was 3 PG 506 days late, and that he must fight if he wished to recapture the city. Advancing to Preston Pans, he camped there in a strong position covered by a marsh, but the Highland army crossed the difficult ground in the dusk of dawn, and fell upon him in the early morning. Cope threw his men into line, and waited to be attacked. The result was a disgraceful rout. The wild rush of the clansmen carried all before it. The bayonets of the regulars proved no match for target and claymore, and the dragoons on the flanks fled in wild panic. Cope left the field among the first, and brought the news of his own defeat to Dunbar, September 21, 1745. The news of the fall of Edinburgh and the Battle of Preston Pans came like a thunderclap to the English government. There was hardly a soldier in the land save the Royal Guards in London. The militia had not been called out, and the temper of the people was unknown. The imbecile Pelhams were at their wits' end, and it is said PG 507 that Newcastle even made secret overtures to the Pretender. If Charles Edward could have marched forward the morning after his victory, there is no knowing where his success would have ended. But the prince halted for 5 weeks, to allow the Highlanders to stow away their plunder, and to raise and arm new levies. This delay was fatal to him. It gave the ministry time to summon over the English troops from Flanders, and to call out the militia, a numerous if not a very serviceable body. When Charles Edward moved forward again on November 3, his chance was already gone. Marshal Wade lay at Newcastle with 10,000 veterans. The Duke of Cumberland with the rest of the army of Flanders was 10 days behind him. The guards and the militia of the southern counties lay on Finchley Common to protect London. The prince, ignorant of the fact that Jacobitism had almost disappeared in England during Walpole's peaceful rule, imagined that Wales and the north would rise in his favour, if only he were to show himself beyond the Tweed with an army at his back. Leaving 4,000 men to garrison Scotland, he crossed the border with 6,000 picked clansmen, routed the Cumbrian militia at Carlisle, and pushed rapidly southward into Lancashire. Before he had been 10 days in England, he saw that he had been deceived as to the temper of the country. Hardly a man joined him. Not 200 recruits were found for him in the Tory county of Lancaster, which had put 2,000 men in the field in the old days of the 15. Hoping against hope, the prince pushed on still further, skillfully eluding the armies of Wade and Cumberland, who tried in vain to enclose him between them. But the Highlanders began to melt away from him, to drive home the cattle they had lifted, and the Jacobite chiefs were dismayed at the utter apathy of the English Tories. By the time that Derby was reached, the rebel army had dwindled down to 3,000 men, and it seemed likely that if Charles Edward persisted in advancing, he would arrive at London alone. Overborne by the arguments of his followers, he gave the order to retreat December 6, 1745. He was ignorant of the effect that his advance had caused in PG 508 the south. Panic prevailed in London, and on the Black Friday, when the news of his arrival at Derby arrived, the timid ministers had been preparing for the worst. The King's plate had been sent on shipboard, the Bank of England had paid away every guinea in its reserve, and the militia at Finchley were fully persuaded that they were to be attacked on the next day by 10,000 wild clansmen. The Highland army slipped back to Scotland with little difficulty, evading both Wade and Cumberland, whose heavy regiments could make no speed over the snowy December roads. On recrossing the border, Charles called up his reserves and was soon at the head of 10,000 men. He trusted to maintain his hold on Scotland, even if England was unassailable. When the royal troops advanced, he inflicted a smart check on their vanguard at the Battle of Falkirk, January 17, 1746, but the English came pouring northward in numbers which he could not hope to resist. The fiery Duke of Cumberland had more than 30,000 men on the march by the spring of the new year, and fresh levies were forming behind him. The Jacobite leaders saw that the day was lost, though hitherto all the fighting had been in their favour. Their undisciplined bands began to disperse once more, and the prince must have known that, unless the French came to his aid, the ruin of his cause was at hand. He was constrained to retire northward, first to Perth, then to Inverness with an ever-dwindling host. Cumberland pushed on in his rear with 8,000 picked men, resolved to revenge the disgraceful days of Prestonpans and Falkirk. The rest of the English army followed at leisure. Charles Edward would not yield without one final blow. With the 5,000 men who still followed his standard, he marched out from Inverness and attacked the Duke on Culloden Moor, Ypres, 1746. Cumberland was ready for the fight. He had warned his troops to receive the Highland rush as if it were a cavalry charge, doubling the files and presenting a triple line of bayonets by making the front ranks kneel, while cannon were placed in the intervals between the regiments. The clansmen charged with their usual fury, but were staggered by the artillery fire, and almost blown to pieces by the triple volley of 3 ranks of infantry PG 509, delivered at a distance of only 50 paces. The survivors straggled up only to perish on the bayonets. The prince's left wing, where the MacDonald clan had held back on a foolish point of tribal jealousy, was still intact, but when the English cavalry advanced, Charles saw that the day was lost and bade his followers disperse. Cumberland tarnished the glory of his victory by the savage cruelty which he displayed. He gave no quarter, shot 200 prisoners in cold blood, and burnt every dwelling in the glens of the rebel clans. A price of £30,000 was put upon the head of Charles Edward, who lurked for 5 months in the West Highlands before he could find a ship to take him to France. He passed through countless perils in safety, and found no man among his unfortunate followers mean enough to betray him in the day of adversity. The story of his romantic escape to Skye in the disguise of the maidservant of Flora MacDonald is well known to all. After this gallant if reckless expedition, Charles Edward never appeared again in English politics. He did not at first despair of striking another blow, and in 1750 paid a secret visit to Britain to see if a second insurrection were possible. But in England the Jacobites were almost extinct, while in Scotland they had been so sorely crushed that they had no power to stir again. The prince had to return having accomplished nothing. Hope long deferred makes the heart sick, and in middle life Charles Edward grew apathetic, took to drinking, and became only the wreck of his old self. When his father died in 1765, he proclaimed himself king as Charles III, but never made another attempt to disturb the peace of England down to his death in 1788. With his brother Henry, a cardinal of the Roman Church, the male line of the Stuarts expired in 1807. The English government dealt very hardly with the insurgents of 1745-6. 3 Scottish peers, the Lords Kilmarnock, Balmerino and Lovat, were beheaded, as was Colonel Townley, the only Englishman of rank who had joined the prince. Many scores of men of less note were hanged or shot. A series of bills was passed in Parliament for weakening the clans and sapping their loyalty to their chiefs. One forbade the wearing of the Highland dress with its tribal tartans. Another abolished the feudal jurisdiction, PG 510, which gave the chiefs power over their followers. Another made the possession of arms a penal offence. Good roads were pushed up into the remoter valleys, and an attempt was made to get rid of the Gaelic language by making English compulsory in schools. A few years later William Pitt took the wise step of endeavouring to turn the restless military energy of the Highlanders into patriotic channels, and raised several of the kilted regiments, which have since distinguished themselves on so many British battlefields. By the end of the century, the Highlands were as quiet as any English shire, and Jacobitism had faded away into a romantic sentiment. The war with France and Spain dragged on for 3 years more, under very indifferent management on both sides. The withdrawal of the English army from Flanders in 1745 had given the French an advantage in the Netherlands, from which they had greatly profited. They had overrun the whole of the Austrian provinces, and in 1746 threatened the frontier of Holland. Cumberland and his army were recalled after the suppression of the Scottish Rising to check the advance of the Maréchal de Saxe, but the Duke suffered at Laufeldt in front of Maastricht, a defeat of much the same character as that of Fontenoy, July 2, 1747. Nevertheless, the French in the following winter consented to treat for peace. They had fared badly along their frontier on the Rhine and in Italy, and looked upon their successes in Belgium as only sufficient to entitle them to ask for a mutual restitution of all conquests. Moreover, their maritime trade had been completely ruined by the war, and several of their colonies had fallen into English hands. Hence came the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in the spring of 1748, to which all the powers who had been engaged in the War of the Austrian Succession gave their assent. Maria Theresa had finally to acquiesce in the loss of Silesia to the King of Prussia, and to make smaller territorial concessions in Italy to Spain and Sardinia, giving Parma to one, and a long slip of the Duchy of Milan to the other. The remainder of her vast dominions she maintained intact, while her husband, Francis of Lorraine, was acknowledged by all parties as emperor, in succession to the unfortunate Charles of Bavaria, who had died in 1745. England, France, and Spain restored to each other all that each had taken, no very considerable amount, and left the great question of their colonial and commercial rivalry quite unsettled. Another and a greater war was required to decide it. The results of the fighting beyond the seas between 1739 and had not been very important. We have already mentioned how the English had failed at Cartagena in 1741. On the other hand, they had captured the French island of Cape Breton, off the mouth of the St. Lawrence in 1744, and had maintained with success a desultory struggle with the enemy along the inland frontier of Canada. One hazardous expedition against the Pacific ports of Spanish America had been carried to a brilliant end by Commodore Anson, who followed in the steps of Drake by capturing the great Acapulco galleon, with the yearly hoard of the mines of Mexico on board, 1743. Like Drake, too, Anson returned to Europe by the Cape route, and brought his ship, the Centurion, back to Spithead in 1744, thus completing the circumnavigation of the world in 3 years. While these comparatively unimportant events had been happening on the American side of the globe, the first war waged between England and France in India had been giving promise of more serious results. Down to the commencement of the 18th century, the great empire of the Mughals had dominated Hindustan, and the traders of the English and French East India companies had been no more than visitors to the coast, allowed to build factories at convenient ports by the bounty of the great Mughal. But in 1707 had died Aurangzeb, the last powerful monarch of that house, and since his death the vast Mohammedan empire which his ancestors had built up was falling rapidly to pieces. Everywhere the Mughal viceroys or nawabs were making themselves independent of their imperial master at Delhi. The native tribes of India also, more especially the brave Marathas of the western Deccan, had been throwing off the Mussulman yoke and starting on a career of conquest. The European settlers in the ports of southern India profited immensely by this relaxation of the central control, which the Mughal government had been wont to exercise, and assumed a much less deferential tone when dealing with the revolted PG 512 Nawabs who now ruled in the Carnatic, Bengal, and the Deccan. It was first during the War of the Austrian Succession that the English and French ventured to engage in hostilities with each other, without paying attention to the native powers, whose sovereign rights they were thereby impugning. The factories of the two powers were scattered along the Coromandel coast in curious alternation, and it was here that the struggle took place. The English were based on their chief settlement at Madras, the French on their stronghold of Pondicherry. 4 years of fighting gave a decided superiority to the French, who were headed by Dupleix, a man of great energy and far-reaching views. He was the first to discover the part that might be played in Indian politics by native troops officered and drilled by Europeans. These sepoys, sipahis is the more correct form, had originally been small armed guards employed by the governors of the factories. Dupleix discovered, from a chance encounter at St. May 1746, that a small body of these disciplined mercenaries could defeat whole hordes of native cavalry, and used his discovery with skill and promptitude. Raising large numbers of sepoys, he built up the first regular army that had been seen in India. In his struggle with the English he was very successful. Madras and almost all the other English factories fell into his hands, and it looked as if the French were to be the sole power in southern Hindustan. The complete triumph of Dupleix was only prevented by his quarrels with his colleague Labourdonnais, the governor of the Mauritius, who had come to his aid at the head of a fleet. They were both energetic and arbitrary, refused to fall in with each other's plans, and so failed to completely expel the English from the Coromandel coast. The other settlements of the East India Company, the island port of Bombay, the old dowry of Catherine of Portugal, and the factory of Fort William at Calcutta in Bengal, were not molested. To the intense disgust of Dupleix, the Treaty of Aachen stipulated the mutual restoration of conquests, and the English settlements were all given back in 1748. In India, as in America, all was left unsettled, and the struggle for supremacy had to be deferred for a space. 8 years of uneasy peace followed the indecisive and vague Treaty of Aachen, 1748–1756. England, under the feeble rule of the two Pelhams, seemed to have sunk back into the same condition of prosperous lethargy which had been her lot in the uneventful days of Walpole. In her political history, there is nothing of moment to relate. The Pelhams had almost silenced opposition by the simple expedient of finding places in the cabinet or the public service for anyone who might have made himself dangerous to them. Even the eloquent and energetic William Pitt, the consistent denouncer of all ministers, had been quieted for a time by the gift of the lucrative post of paymaster of the forces. Room was found for so many and diverse persons in the Pelham cabinet that it was known as the Broad-Bottom administration. The Pelhams, though using the old Whig catchwords about liberty and reform, were, like Walpole, only anxious to keep things quiet and to preserve themselves in office. Hence there is little or nothing to record of their doings. We may mention, however, the creation of our celebrate per cents, by Henry Pelham, who was somewhat of a financier, his sole accomplishment. The national debt, then a sum of £78 million, was paying 4%. At the time of the Treaty of Aachen, the Premier, seeing that the public credit was good and money cheap, resolved to reduce the rate of interest. This he accomplished by borrowing money at 3%, to pay off all those national creditors who would not accept the new scale. The conversion was accomplished with ease, and relieved the revenue of some £500,000 a year of expenses. The debt, thus reduced and simplified, received its new name of consols, all the old loans having been consolidated into one 1750. A word may be also given to the reform of the calendar in 1752. England up to this time had used the Old Style, or Julian calendar, invented by Julius Caesar 18 centuries before. A slight error in the calculation of the great Roman had made the year too short, and in the lapse of the ages this error had grown by accumulation into as much as 11 days. England, later than most nations, adopted the Reformed or Gregorian calendar, named PG 514 after Pope Gregory XIII, during the Pelham administration. Thus, the change being made on September 2, 1752, the day that followed became the 14th instead of the 3rd. This bewildered the multitude, and was made a serious charge against the minister by many ignorant folks, who complained that they had been defrauded of 11 days of their lives. In such comparatively trifling events, the middle years of the 18th century passed away. The stagnant times of the old Whig oligarchy were drawing towards their close, and the movements which were to stir England so deeply in the next generation were beginning to develop. We have already spoken of the increasing commercial supremacy of England in the period. This growth in foreign trade was now beginning to be supplemented by an increased activity in manufacturing industry, which was to be the distinguishing mark of the second half of the century. But the first signs of it were already apparent before 1750. The earliest attempt for the improvement of the inland communications of the kingdom may be traced to 1720, when the Irwell Canal was opened to Manchester. As important a landmark is the discovery of the process of smelting iron by means of coal in 1740. Up to this time iron had always been worked with charcoal, and the manufacture of it had been almost confined to the wooded districts of southern England, most especially to the Sussex Weald. But the new process opened up the Yorkshire iron mines, which were to completely supersede those of the south, for in the north iron and coal are found together in most convenient proximity. All this development, however, belongs to the times of George III, rather than those of George II. Even more important in the history of the social life of England than the expansion of her commercial resources was another change which began about the middle of the 18th century in the sphere of spiritual things. The Whig supremacy in the state, which had begun in 1714, had the most deplorable results on the Church. Walpole and his disciples were men quite out of sympathy with any religious impulse. Their lives and morals would not bear looking into, and they openly scoffed at religion. To them, the PG 515 Church was simply a field of patronage for friends and dependents, and a machine for supplementing the working of the state. Down to the time of Anne's death, the Tory party had been supreme within the bounds of the establishment, and the Whigs therefore viewed the whole body of the clergy with suspicion. They stopped in 1717 the meetings of convocation, which had existed from time immemorial, wishing to prevent the clerical body from finding a mouthpiece. They systematically officered the Church with Whig bishops, of whom nothing was asked but political orthodoxy. As was likely, men chosen on this principle were often most unfit pastors of the Church. A Walpole or a Pelham was not likely to select men whose characteristics were fervour or enthusiasm. The Whig bishops were generally of two classes: either they were prominent political clergy, court chaplains and the like, who laid themselves out to win preferment by their sermons, or they were Greek play bishops, to use an expressive phrase, mere scholars, whose title to promotion was to have edited a classic author or ruled a public school. Both classes were, as a rule, very inefficient. Many were scandalous non-residents, and seldom went near their dioceses, dwelling in London all the year round and haunting the court. Remote sees like Bangor or Carlisle hardly knew the face of their bishops. Some of these prelates were more notable for their political than their religious orthodoxy, of these latitudinarian. Bishops perhaps the best known is Hoadley, whom the Whigs promoted to 4 sees one after another, in spite of the fact that his views on the Trinity were hardly consistent with his position as a member of the Church. It was not to be expected that such prelates would be in touch with their subordinates, the country clergy, who still for the most part remained Tory in their views, looked on the least measure for the political emancipation of dissenters or Romanists with horror, and nourished a strong personal dislike for the 2 first Georges and their ministers. Hence came such a breach in the unity and organization of the Church as had never been seen before. The upper clergy were careless and unspiritual, the lower clergy grew lethargic and apathetic under the neglect of their superiors. There was a general tendency to praise common sense and morality, and to sneer at theological learning or evangelical fervour. This general deadness in the Church could not long continue without causing a reaction. The great feature in the second quarter of the 18th century was the appearance of the Methodist movement, of which John Wesley was the originator. Shocked by the want of energy and enthusiasm among the clergy, Wesley, a fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford, devoted himself to active evangelical work, and especially to public preaching. He is first heard of as preaching to the poor of neglected Oxford parishes, and to the prisoners in the jail, 1729. A few years later he went out as a missionary to America, and laboured in the backwoods of Georgia. Returning in 1738, he resumed his work in England, passing from place to place, and addressing large congregations of all sorts and conditions of men. His fervent eloquence and enthusiasm came as a revelation to the neglected masses of the cities, or to congregations condemned to many years of sermons on dry morality. He spoke of sin and conversion with an earnestness which had not been seen since the days of early Puritan enthusiasm. Wesley and the numerous followers who sprang up to join him might have inspired the Church with a new spirit of fervour, if they had but been permitted to do so. But unfortunately, the latitudinarian bishops disliked his emotional harangues and his clear-cut dogma, and the parish clergy often treated him as an intruder when he appeared inside their cures. Hence, though a strong churchman at first, he was gradually driven into schism, and became the founder of a new nonconformist sect, instead of the restorer of the spirituality of the Church from within. Towards the end of his 60 years of labour, 1729-91, he took the final step of ordaining preachers and allowing them to celebrate the sacraments, thus committing his followers to abandoning the national church. His work, however, was not without its effect inside the Church of England. Many who sympathised with him remained churchmen, and from them came the evangelical or newer Low Church party within the establishment. from Wesley and his contemporaries began a decided improvement in the moral life of England. After remaining at its lowest ebb in the 80 years that followed the Restoration, it began to mend about the middle of the century. The change is marked in all the PG 517 most characteristic spheres of action by an increased humanity to prisoners, paupers, and slaves, an improved tone in literature and the drama, and a growing demand for the observation of a higher standard of morals by public men. Political corruption and ostentatious ill-living, which had been the rule in the beginning of the 18th century, had become the exception at its end. But if England was more serious and more moral by the end of the century, no small share in that result must be attributed to the sobering effect of 3 long and desperate wars, which more than once seemed about to be the ruin of the realm. Between 1756 and there were to be 36 years of war to 23 of peace, and 2 whole generations were bred up in times of stress and trouble, which developed the sterner virtues, and taught men no longer to sneer at fervour, whether displayed in patriotism or in religion. The 7 Years' War, into which England was plunged in 1756, while still under the imbecile guidance of the elder Pelham, was the most important struggle in which she had engaged since the days of the Spanish Armada. It definitely settled all the points which had been left undetermined by the Peace of Aachen, and gave her the empire of the seas and the lion's share of the commerce of the world. Her hold on these gains was to be shaken in later wars, but never lost. The 7 Years' War, like the War of the Austrian Succession, had 2 sides, the colonial and the European. In 1756, as in 1742, England, while contending for her own objects beyond seas, was also subsidizing a powerful continental ally, who had his own interests to serve, in order to distract the attention of France from the more distant struggle. The new war resembled the old in another respect. In each case it was the colonial quarrel which first came to the front. The European strife was a later development. The causes which provoked the 7 Years' War were to be found both in America and in India. In both of these quarters, the representatives of England and of France came to blows before the mother countries had resolved on war. The quarrel was the result of natural causes which made it inevitable, and not the deliberate work of the timid Newcastle or the selfish Louis XV. It was in India that the first hostilities broke out, not very long after the Peace of Aachen had been signed. We have already mentioned how the French governor Dupleix had raised an army of sepoys, and resolved to employ it for the furtherance of French interests in southern India. He was enabled to do this by the fact that a war of succession had broken out in each of the 2 great native states, which were neighbours to the European settlements on the Coromandel coast. In the Deccan, 2 princes of the Nizam family, an uncle and a nephew, were disputing for the throne of Hyderabad. In the Carnatic, a rebellious minister was trying to usurp his master's throne. Dupleix resolved to sell the aid of his army to one pretender for use against the other. The appearance of his disciplined battalions in the field settled the fortune of war at once. He gained for his ally Muzaffar Jung the whole of the Hyderabad dominions. Then he turned against the Carnatic, slew the old Nawab in battle, and drove his son Muhammad Ali into Trichinopoly, his last stronghold. The rebel minister Chunda Sahib was then saluted as ruler of the land. The 2 new Nawabs soon became the mere creatures of Dupleix, whose military strength completely overawed their motley armies. They lavished millions of rupees upon him, and Muzaffar Jung gave him the title of Supreme Vizier of all India south of the river Kistna, and appointed him permanent chief of his army. Dupleix was in truth master of southern India, a fact viewed with dismay by the English settlers along the Coromandel coast. They had, in rivalry with him, espoused the cause of the 2 Nawabs whom he had crushed. One of these princes was now dead, the other besieged in his last stronghold. The rulers of Madras despaired, but a single bold spirit persuaded them to venture a blow against the power of the Frenchman. Robert Clive, the scapegrey son of a Shropshire squire, had been sent out to Madras as a clerk in the East India Company's service to keep him out of mischief. But he changed his pen for the sword, and became a captain in the company's army. Now he persuaded Governor Saunders to entrust him with a few hundred men, to make a diversion in favour of the besieged Nawab, Muhammad Ali. To draw away the army which was beleaguering Trichinopoly, Clive resolved to PG 519 strike at the capital of the Carnatic, the town of Arcot. Marching by night and with great speed, he seized the place and fortified himself in its citadel. He was at once attacked by the forces of the Chunda Sahib, aided by a division of the army of Dupleix, but he contrived to inspire his 500 men with such obstinate courage that they repulsed all the assaults of 10,000 enemies, and finally compelled the Nawab's army to withdraw foiled, 1751. After thus winning Arcot, Clive was entrusted by the Madras Council with all their disposable troops, 200 Europeans and English sepoys. With these reinforcements he took the field against Dupleix and Chunda Sahib, routed a number of French detachments, and finally recovered the whole of the Carnatic from Muhammad Ali, the protégé of the English. Chunda Sahib surrendered to his enemy, who had him murdered. Dupleix played a losing game against his greater rival for 2 more years, and was finally recalled in disgrace by the French government, 1754. Thus the English carried out the lesson which the great Frenchman had taught them, that India might be conquered with Indian arms, and that its princes might be made the vassals of the mere traders who had paid them humble tribute a few years before. With the establishment of the English suzerainty over the Nawab Muhammad Ali and his realm of the Carnatic begins the English Empire in Hindustan. Clive and Dupleix had posed as the mere auxiliaries of the Nawabs, and their struggle was not supposed to commit the mother country to war, but a less disguised form of hostilities between England and France commenced somewhat later in America. Its cause was the want of any definite boundary between the settlements of the two nations. It was the ambition of the English colonists to push westward from Pennsylvania and Virginia, and gradually to colonize all the waste lands, sparsely inhabited by savage Indian tribes, which lay between them and the Mississippi. But the French had another and a no less ambitious scheme. Besides their dominions in Canada, they possessed another colony at the mouth of the Mississippi, round the town of New Orleans. They claimed that this territory of Louisiana stretched up to the headwaters of the Great River, and it was their object PG 520 to connect it with Canada by a string of forts placed along the Mississippi and its tributary the Ohio. If they could have carried out this gigantic and wide-stretching plan, they would have shut in the English colonies between the Allegheny Mountains and the sea, and prevented them from extending into the interior of the continent. The weak point of the plan was that the French were far too few in numbers to execute any such project, though they counted among them many hardy backwoodsmen and fur traders who had explored all the waterways of the West. They could not back these pioneers up with solid masses of population. There were not more than 180,000 PG 521 French emigrants in America, while the English colonies boasted at this time nearly 2 million sturdy settlers. In spite of this disparity of numbers, the French governors were set on executing their venturous scheme. It was their active advance into the wilderness that lay between Canada and the English colonies that brought about the first collisions with the English outposts. The 3 northern links of the chain that was to join Canada with Louisiana were Fort Ticonderoga, at the south end of Lake Champlain, Fort Niagara, near the Great Falls between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and Fort Duquesne, at the headwaters of the Ohio. The first and last of these were a very few miles from the English-backed settlements, and their establishment in 1754-55 was looked upon as a direct challenge by the inhabitants of Pennsylvania and Virginia. In 1754, a party of Virginian militia, headed by Major George Washington, of whom we shall hear much later on, made a dash on Fort Duquesne. But they were beaten and forced to surrender after a fight at Great Meadows. This provoked the colonies, and at their request General Braddock repeated the attack in the next year with a force of 2,200 men, part of whom were British regulars. But he was drawn into an ambuscade by a very inferior force of French and Indians. His force was disgracefully routed, and he himself was slain. The fighting at once began to spread, and both England and France sent out reinforcements to America. Yet the two nations were still nominally at peace, and the French, who were just about to engage in a great war in Germany, were not anxious to commence hostilities with England at this particular moment. Newcastle, however, precipitated the outbreak of the struggle by a characteristic half-measure. He sent out Admiral Boscawen with orders not to attack all French ships, but to intercept a particular squadron carrying troops to Canada. Boscawen met it and took 2 vessels after a fight. This made war inevitable. It broke out in the spring of 1756, and opened with a series of disasters for England, a fact which causes no surprise when we remember that her forces were under the direction of the imbecile Newcastle. Just at the same moment, another struggle was commencing on the continent. The Empress Maria Theresa had never forgiven the King of Prussia for robbing her of Silesia in the PG 522 hour of her distress. 14 years before, she had devoted much time and trouble to forming a great coalition for the purpose of punishing the plunderer, and had secretly enlisted in her alliance France, Russia, Sweden, Saxony, and most of the smaller German states, for the unscrupulous and rapacious Frederick was not viewed with love by his neighbors, and it was easy to combine them against him. His venomous pen had made enemies of two vindictive women, Elizabeth Empress of Russia and Madame de Pompadour, the all-powerful mistress of Louis XV. And though political expediency did not prescribe war with Prussia to either Russia or France, yet personal resentment brought it about. The open war between England and France had broken out in the spring of 1756. In the autumn of the same year the continental struggle began. Getting secret intelligence of the plot that was maturing against him, Frederick resolved to strike before his numerous adversaries were ready, and invaded Saxony. He overran the whole electorate and annihilated the Saxon army in a fortnight. But Austria, Russia, Sweden and France immediately fell upon him, and he had much ado to avoid being crushed by brute force of numbers, for Prussia was but a small state of 5 million souls, while the Confederacy ranged against her counted half Europe in its ranks. Alone among a host of foes, Frederick was desperately in need of an ally, and only one ally was possible, England, for both England and Prussia were now at war with France, and it was obvious that they ought to aid each other against their common foe. Moreover, the English government was itself sadly in need of assistance, for the war had opened with a series of disasters in more than one quarter of the world. The most serious loss had been suffered in the Mediterranean. A French fleet and army under the Duc de Richelieu had slipped out of Toulon and fallen on Minorca, the Spanish island which had formed part of England's plunder at the Peace of Utrecht. The English garrison was weak, for it had always been supposed that we were strong enough at sea to prevent the enemy from approaching this important possession, PG 523, which was to us then what Malta is now. But when the Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Byng came up to relieve the troops beleaguered in the citadel of Port Mahon, a disgraceful sight was seen. The English admiral, finding that the French squadron was slightly superior to his own, refused to fight and fled away to Gibraltar, though his second-in-command urged him hotly to risk everything in order to save the island. The deserted garrison held out a month longer, and then was forced to surrender June 1756. Nor was this the only disaster with which the 7 Years' War opened. Montcalm, the French commander in Canada, made a dash against the frontier garrisons of the British colonists in America, and took Forts Oswego and William Henry, our outposts on the northwest. Still more shocking news was on its way home from India. The Nawab of Bengal, a cruel and debauched tyrant named Suraj Dowlah, had picked a quarrel with the governor of Calcutta, the English factory near the mouth of the Ganges. Suddenly declaring war in June 1756, the same month that Minorca was lost, he captured Calcutta with ease. In his hour of triumph, he bade his guards thrust all his captives into the Black Hole, a small dungeon not much more than 20 feet square, which had been wont to serve as the prison of the factory. No less than 146 persons, merchants, officials, soldiers and women, were driven into this confined space and locked in for the night. They were tightly wedged together, had no air save from 2 narrow-barred windows and could not move. In the stifling heat of a Bengal June, nearly the whole of them perished of suffocation. Only 23, one of whom was a woman, were found alive next morning. The horrors of the Black Hole were soon to be revenged, but long ere the news of the punishment which Clive wreaked on the Nawab came home, the Newcastle ministry had been driven from office. The popular outcry at the mismanagement of the war, and above all at the loss of Minorca, had been too great for the feeble Newcastle to withstand. It was in vain that he arrested Byng and promised to try him for cowardice. For Byng could not be made the scapegoat for disasters in America or India, and the universal indignation PG 524 against Newcastle's administration of the war forced him to resign in November 1756, shortly after the admiral was tried by court-martial, condemned and shot, for disobedience to orders and for criminal feebleness, though he was acquitted of any treasonable intent or personal cowardice. His death served, as Voltaire remarked at the time, poor encourager les autres, and English admirals since then have never shirked an engagement with an enemy of only slightly superior force. The king summoned the opposition Whigs to form a cabinet, and William Pitt and the Duke of Devonshire took office. Pitt, as we have already had occasion to remark, was the fighting man of the Whig party, and the advocate of a vigorous colonial and commercial policy. He was the one statesman of the day who commanded the confidence of the nation, because he was the only one whose reputation was entirely free from the stain of political corruption. He was an able, eloquent man, whose scathing denunciations of the errors and feebleness of the late ministry were convincing to all who heard them. It remained to be seen if his own administration would prove more successful. At first, however, it seemed likely that Pitt would have small opportunity of trying his hand at the helm. Though he was trusted by the nation, he was not trusted by the House of Commons. Newcastle set himself to overthrow his successor by bidding his hirelings in the lower house to vote consistently against the new ministers. Moreover, King George disliked Pitt for his vehemence and his pompous language. Hence came a vexatious crisis in April 1757, when Pitt found himself in a minority in the House of Commons, and was dismissed from office by the king. But the public outcry against the proposed resumption of office by Newcastle was so loud that a curious and not very satisfactory compromise was arranged. The Duke offered to take Pitt as his colleague, and to give him a free hand in the management of the war and all foreign policy, if he himself were permitted to retain the direction of domestic affairs. Pitt believed himself to be necessary to his country. He thought that he could bring the war to a successful conclusion, and that no one else could do so. Hence, though he was thoroughly acquainted with the mean and intriguing spirit of the Duke, he pg 525 took his offer. Newcastle wanted no more than the power of managing Parliament and dispensing patronage. His ideas of government went no further. In return, he placed his subservient parliamentary majority at Pitt's disposal. The result was, as a shrewd contemporary observer remarked, that Mr. Pitt does everything, and the Duke of Newcastle gives everything. The Pitt-Newcastle ministry lasted nearly 6 years, and its excellent results almost justified the ignominious compact on which it was founded. Soon after Pitt got the control of affairs, the fortune of war began to mend. His first attempts at launching expeditions against France were, it is true, unsuccessful. The Duke of Cumberland was sent to Hanover to defend the electorate against the French, but he suffered the same misfortune as at Fontenoy and Lauffelt, once more showing himself a brave soldier, but a bad strategist. At Hasenbeck he was defeated, and retiring northward was pressed back against the North Sea near Stade, and forced to sign the Convention of Closter 7, by which the Hanoverian army laid down its arms, June 1757. This disaster exposed the western frontier of Prussia to the French, and might have proved the ruin of King Frederick. But that marvellous general saved himself by the rapid blows which he dealt to west and east. Flying into central Germany, he routed the French at Rossbach November 5, and then, returning to Silesia before the Austrians had missed him, he defeated the troops of the Empress at Leuthen December 5. Thus he won himself 6 months' respite, and during that time Pitt raised another army for service in Germany, which was placed under Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, a distant cousin of the royal family, but a general of very different order from the unlucky George of Cumberland. This force effectually protected the western borders of Prussia and the electorate of Hanover from the French during the remainder of the war. With the opening of the year 1758 began a succession of victories all over the world, which effectually justified the claims of Pitt to be the restorer of the greatness of Britain. He had everywhere put new vigour into the PG 526 struggle, by placing young generals, chosen by himself, at the head of his expeditions, and by raising loans for war expenses with a profusion which appalled more timid financiers. Part of this wealth was lavished on the King of Prussia, whose aid was invaluable in distracting the forces of France. "I am conquering Canada on the plains of Germany," observed Pitt to those who reproached him for the vast subsidies which he sent to Frederick, and the epigram was true, for the reinforcements which were absolutely necessary if France was to retain her American possessions were being sent across the Rhine to join in the great European struggle. Pitt, in fact, was working out to a glorious end the policy which Carteret had sketched nearly 20 years before. While Ferdinand of Brunswick with his Anglo-Hanoverian army beat the French at Krefeld and kept them back on the Rhine, June 1758, still more important things were being effected in America. A general advance was made along the whole front of the French possessions in America. In the north, Admiral Boscawen and the young General Wolfe captured Louisbourg, the strongly fortified capital of the island of Cape Breton. In the south, Fort Duquesne was occupied by a force consisting mainly of colonial militia, and thus the line of French communications between Canada and Louisiana was effectually cut. The jubilant colonists changed the name of the place to Pittsburgh in honor of the great minister. Only in the center of the advance was a reverse sustained. There the French commander, the gallant Montcalm, had collected the bulk of his forces behind the ramparts of Ticonderoga, to bar the line of advance up the Hudson. General Abercrombie was repulsed with fearful loss when he attempted to take the place by assault, though his men did all that could be done, and Pitt's new Highland regiments absolutely filled the ditch with their bodies ere they could be forced to retire. But the fall of Canada was only delayed a few months by this check to the British arms. The next year, 1759, was even more fertile in successes. The naval strength of France received its final blow in 2 decisive battles. The French Mediterranean fleet ran out of Toulon and tried to escape into the Atlantic, but Admiral Bascon met them off Lagos in PG 527 Portugal and took or destroyed most of the vessels. Some months later, Admiral Hawke attacked the French Atlantic fleet, which had come out of Brest and was lying in Quiberon Bay. Though a fierce storm was raging, he ran into the bay and forced the enemy to engage. In the heat of the fight, many of their ships were driven ashore and lost, while Hawke carried off 2 prizes, and only a few out of the hostile fleet escaped into the mouth of the river Vilaine. After the battles of Lagos and Quiberon Bay, the enemy never attempted to appear at sea in any force during the remaining 4 years of the war. Indeed, the French marine was almost entirely destroyed, for 64 line-of-battle ships had been sunk or taken in 1758–1759. In the same year, a great victory had been gained in Germany. When the French reinforced their army of the Rhine and again pushed forward toward Hanover, Prince Ferdinand gave them battle at Minden, and inflicted on them a defeat which sent them back in haste towards their own borders. The chief honor of the fight fell to 7 regiments of English infantry, which received and repelled the fierce charges of the whole of the cavalry of the French army. But a slur was cast on the victory by the misconduct of Lord George Sackville, the general of the English horse, who refused, out of temper or cowardice, to charge the broken enemy and complete their rout. Nevertheless, the fight did its work, and proved the salvation of our ally Frederick II, who was just at this moment in the depths of despair. He had suffered a fearful defeat at the hands of the Russians at Kunersdorf on the Oder, and was only saved from complete destruction by being able to draw aid from the victorious army of Prince Ferdinand. But events of far greater import had happened in America during this summer. Pitt had sketched out a concentric attack on Canada from 3 sides. General Amherst had taken Ticonderoga, the fort that had baffled Abercrombie in the previous year, while another expedition captured Fort Niagara and the other western strongholds of the French. But the main blow was struck in the north. An English fleet appeared in the St. Lawrence and put ashore General Wolfe, Pitt's favorite officer, with an army of 8,000 men. Montcalm hurried to the spot with all the French regulars in the province and a horde of Canadian militia, and PG 528 hastened to the defense of Quebec, the capital of the land. The place was very strongly placed, being protected on 2 sides by the rivers St. Lawrence and St. Charles and watched by Montcalm's entrenched camp at Beauport. After failing to break the French lines, Wolfe ventured on a hazardous flank attack. The cliffs overhanging the St. Lawrence were believed to be inaccessible, as there was only a single precipitous goat track which mounted them, and this was protected by a guard. But Wolfe resolved to risk the danger of assaulting them. His PG 529 men dropped down the river in boats under cover of the night, reached the foot of the crags, and crept up one after another on hands and knees, pulling themselves up by the aid of trees and shrubs. The French picket at the top was surprised and fled. Thus Wolfe had men in line on the ground above the cliffs, the heights of Abraham, before the day dawned. When they became visible to Montcalm, he was forced to come out of his impregnable lines and fight in the open, under pain of losing Quebec. There followed a short, sharp conflict, in which the English had from the first the advantage. The Canadian militia fled in panic, the French regulars were cut to pieces, and Montcalm himself was mortally wounded. But Wolfe had also been struck down in the moment of victory. He lived just long enough to hear that the battle was won, and died on the field, September 13, 1759. He was only 33, and had he survived would have had a long career of glory before him, but to have conquered America for England was in itself a sufficient title to immortality, for the Battle of Quebec was the decisive day in the history of the continent. The wrecks of the French army evacuated the capital and fell back on Montreal. Thither they were followed in the next spring both by the forces under Amherst, which had ascended the Hudson, and by Wolfe's army from Quebec. Surrounded by vastly superior numbers, de Vaudreuil, the Viceroy of Canada, was forced to lay down his arms and surrender the remnant of the French possessions in the north. Thus ended in ignominious failure the great scheme which Montcalm had formed for securing inland America for his king, and penning the English colonists between the ocean and the Alleghanies. The British flag now waved without a rival from the North Pole to the boundary of Spanish America. Meanwhile, events of importance had been happening in the Far East. While England was laying her hand on the western continent, she was also winning her first territorial dominions in India. We have already told the tale of the Black Hole and the fall of Calcutta. Its sequel has yet to be related. Just when the news of Suraj ad-Dowlah's wicked doings reached Madras, Clive chanced to return from England, where he had been for 2 years on leave. The task of chastising the Nawab was at once made over to him. He PG 530 was entrusted with 1 regiment of British troops, the 39th, which bears on its colours the honourable legend Primus in Indies, and with 2,000 Madras sepoys. With this small force, he did not hesitate to invade the vast but unwarlike province of Bengal. He forced his way up the Hooghly and recovered Calcutta with ease, but he hesitated some time before advancing into the interior to strike at the Nawab's capital of Murshidabad. Soon, however, he learnt that Suraj ad-Dowlah was hated by his subjects, and that his own ministers were ready to betray him. Armed with this knowledge, Clive advanced from Calcutta as far as the village of Plassey, where he found himself in face of the Nawab's hordes, 50,000 irregular horse and foot of the worst quality. The English were attacked but feebly and half-heartedly, for the enemy had no confidence in their prince. Moreover, Mir Jafar, who commanded one wing of his army, had sold himself to Clive for the promise of his master's throne, and held aloof all day, like Northumberland at Bosworth Field. At the hour of noon Clive bade his men charge, and the contemptible soldiery of Suraj ad-Dowlah fled before the assault, though they outnumbered the English by 18 to 1. Only the Nawab's French artillerymen stood firm and were bayoneted at their guns. This battle, which gave England the rich realm of Bengal, was won with a loss of only 72 men to the victors. Clive soon seized Murshidabad and installed Mir Jafar as Nawab in his master's room. The deposed tyrant was caught by his successor and promptly strangled. Mir Jafar ruled for the future as the dependent of England, paid the East India Company a tribute, and acted as their vassal. Thus Bengal, though not annexed, was for all practical purposes made a part of the British Empire. Clive sullied his laurels by 2 acts which show the unscrupulous character that was allied with his great talents. Before Plassey, a Bengali named Omichand discovered the intrigue with Mir Jafar and threatened to reveal it to the Nawab. Clive bought him off by a forged promise of money signed with the name of Admiral Watson. When the danger was over, he avowed his forgery to the traitor, who thereupon went mad with rage and disappointed greed. After Plassey, Clive committed his second fault, by accepting for his private use huge sums of gold which Mir Jafar offered him. When PG 531 taunted with this, he only replied that he was astonished at his own moderation, considering the enormously larger amount that he might have asked and received. 1757. After settling Bengal and defeating an attempt to reconquer it made by Shah Alam, the heir of the great Mughals, Clive returned to England in 1759 to be saluted as the conqueror of the East. While Clive was overrunning Bengal, the English armies in the Carnatic were making an end of the small remnants of the French power in India. The operations were protracted, till in January 1760, Sir Eyre Coote routed the last French army at Wandiwash, and ere another year was out, Pondicherry and all the other strongholds of the enemy were in his hands. While England was thus triumphant alike in Europe, India and America, and Pitt was at the height of his glory, the old king, George II, died suddenly in his 78th year, October 25, 1760. His death made an instant change in the national politics both at home and abroad, for his successor was not one of those sovereigns who were contented to obey their ministers and meekly bear the yoke of the great Whig oligarchy.